In the last section, we put together a little bit of boilerplate for our application, and I also just set up ESLint, and I'm so happy I did. This is a fantastic example of the tiny mistakes that it keeps you from making. You'll notice that in the path inside of my index files, I listed app with a capital A, when in fact we created the file with a lowercase a. So I'm just going to go with the lowercase version. So inside of index iOS.js, I'll fix up the path to be src/app, and inside of my Android.js, I'll make sure I do the same. Okay, so just a little bit of a typo there. Cool. So in this section, we're going to set up the Redux side of things inside of our application. Now, I want to tell you right now that unfortunately setting up the Redux side of things requires typing out a pretty good amount of code where it's just going to look kind of mysterious to us, okay? So generally when I teach Redux, I love to give people or beginners a kind of boilerplate application, you know, something with a very low level Redux code already put together, just because it helps us from getting really caught in the weeds right at the get-go. But since with React Native, we generate a new project on the fly, it kind of makes it a little bit harder to start off with like, you know, some pre-built application that I've worked on. Anyways, the point of what I'm saying here is we're going to go through a little bit of setup. I don't think it's going to be that painful, but we are going to see a pretty decent amount of code for stuff that we haven't really touched on before. Let's just get to it, and you guys can let me know if it's, in retrospect, if it's really crazy or not. We'll see how it turns out. So I'm going to be giving some amount of discussion about what's going on, but for the most part, we're going to kind of try to get through the setup and then focus on learning what's going on. I'm inside of my app file right now, and at the very top, I'm going to import two things. I'm going to import provider from React Redux, and I'm going to import create store from Redux. Notice that the last three import statements that I have right now all have curly braces around them. Okay, so curly braces around provider, curly braces around create store as well. Now the create store function right here probably looks a little bit familiar, right? We got that from Redux, we tested it out inside the browser. It is what creates our store object, but the provider object certainly is not. And in addition, this whole library of React Redux, you know, what the heck is that? I thought we were just doing Redux. Well, let's just add a little bit more code, and then we'll discuss about what each of these is doing. So inside of my app component, I'm going to wrap the view tag right here with the provider tag. So that thing that we just imported, it is a JSX component, so I can render it as the provider. Next, I'm going to pass the provider a store. So I'm going to just put in here create store. And for right now, I'm not going to call create store, I'm just going to pass it the method, just like so, just this right here. So let's talk about what the provider tag right here does. I'm going to pull up a diagram to help us out with that definition a little bit. The provider tag works together with the store. Each of them has a very specific job. So the store is what actually holds our application state, you know, like all the data within our application. So in this diagram right here, I've got the store sitting right here, and I'm saying that it has like basically pieces of state called state 1, state 2, state 3, state 4, okay? The purpose of the provider, on the other hand, is what translates all the data in that store into something that can be used by the React side of our application. So the store is the thing that holds our state, while the provider is communication glue with React. You may have noticed that when we were working with Redux over in the browser, we didn't touch a single thing that said React anywhere, right? Like there wasn't a single thing that we were working with on the Redux side that said, oh yeah, hook up to React at this point in time. Like that never ever happened. So the real truth behind Redux as a library is, yeah, it was definitely made with React in mind, right? Like the author wrote it with React in mind, but they did not design the library. Redux was not designed to only work with React. It doesn't really have any React specific bindings to it whatsoever, nothing that makes it work nicely with React. That's the job of the React Redux library that we just installed. So this React Redux library is the communication glue between Redux and React. It's what makes them play nicely together. So at this point in time, we've got some amount of boilerplate on here. We've got our create store call. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a reducer, and we're going to pass it to this create store right here. So remember, when we were in the browser, when we tried to create a store, and we just said like create store, we got an error message thrown back to us that said, hey, you have to throw in at least one reducer here. So we're going to create one reducer and then pass it into the store. The only kind of flip here, the only kind of the way in which I'm going to make things really confusing, let me just be blunt about that, is that we're going to do it in we're going to create this reducer in a slightly different way than how we made the last one. So just bear with me for a moment. Inside of my source directory, I'm going to make a new folder called reducers. And then inside of here, I'm going to make a new file called index.js. So index.js right here, remember that shares the same pattern as that like common components folder that we had before. So in theory, we might have many other reducers inside this file, but they will all be imported into this index file right here. So this index file is kind of like the window to the rest of the world as far as reducers go. So now here's the kind of weird part that I mentioned. We're going to say import combine reducers from Redux. Notice that I have curly braces around combine reducers here as well. We are pulling this property out of the Redux library. Now we had previously created a Redux store with just one reducer, but in the vast majority of apps, you'll want to have multiple reducers, okay, like multiple different pieces of state. To make all these different reducers play nicely together, we use this combine reducers function from the Redux library. We'll shortly see the impact that combine reducers has on our application state. For right now, let's just get our example working. I'm going to put down export default combine reducers, and I'm going to pass it an object. It's going to have a single key of libraries, and that's going to return an empty array for right now. So at this point, we created one reducer. It's going to have the name libraries, and by default, that reducer always returns an array, no matter what. So even if an action comes through this reducer, we are always going to get an array returned. Finally, we need to wire this reducer up, as simple and and non-functional as it is, I suppose, to our create store call. So we need to get that reducer over to create store right here. So inside of our app file, I will import reducers from in the current directory, get the reducers folder. So in the current directory, get the reducers folder. And I don't have to put on /index here because just by importing the folder, it's implied that I want the index file. And finally, I'll pass in reducers to the create store call. So reducers. There we go. Whew, that's it. That is the bare minimum amount of Redux it takes to set up an application. We created a store and passed it to the provider tag. We also created one reducer and we passed it to the store when we created it. So this is a good start. Let's continue going in the next section.